China spent years trying to make the region believe that Japan had already been psychologically defeated at sea. Through relentless gray zone pressure, constant naval harassment, airspace intimidation, maritime militia swarms, and blockade rehearsals around Taiwan and the East China Sea, Beijing tried to build a single terrifying message into the strategic mind of Asia. China can close the gates whenever it wants, and nobody will dare challenge it inside the waters it claims as its own. But then came the move Chinese planners never wanted to see, never expected to see, and perhaps never truly believed Japan would dare to make. On April 17th, for the first time in many years, a Japanese destroyer entered the Taiwan Strait and sailed straight through one of the most politically explosive waterways on Earth. That ship, the JS Ikazuchi, did not creep incautiously. It did not hesitate. It did not turn back. It moved south through waters Beijing treats like a guarded political fortress, and it did so in full view of the Chinese military. For Tokyo, this was not just a transit. It was a message written in steel. What made the moment even more dramatic was the timing. Just 48 hours earlier, Russian warships had arrived in China in what looked like a carefully staged display of strategic unity meant to intimidate the region. Moscow and Beijing wanted to project an image of deep military coordination in the Pacific, a warning to Japan, a warning to the United States, and a reminder that the authoritarian powers operating across Eurasia could synchronize pressure from multiple directions. But what followed instead was a reversal of psychological momentum. Rather than shrinking back, Japan answered almost immediately with one of the boldest naval signals it has sent in modern times. The image of a Japanese destroyer cutting through the Taiwan Strait only 2 days after Russian combat ships visited a Chinese naval base shattered the carefully staged atmosphere of intimidation that Beijing and Moscow were trying to create. The transit itself was a deliberate act of strategic theater backed by real military nerve. In the dark early hours of the morning, the JS Ikazuchi entered the strait and kept going. For roughly 14 hours, it maintained a steady, visible passage from the East China Sea toward the south, moving through a narrow and deeply contested corridor that China watches obsessively. Beijing monitors every movement in that zone because the Taiwan Strait is not merely a waterway to the Chinese leadership. It is a test of sovereignty, status, legitimacy, and military credibility. The moment that destroyer entered the strait, Chinese naval and air units reportedly went on high alert. Radar systems locked on. Missile launchers were oriented toward the ship. Warning messages echoed across radio frequencies. Every signal Beijing could send short of force was sent. But when the defining moment came, China did not physically stop the ship. It did not fire a warning shot. It did not compel a course change. It watched. That matters because it exposed the gap between rhetoric and action. Beijing has spent years presenting itself as the unquestioned enforcer of these waters, building a myth of absolute dominance through military exercises, constant patrols, airspace notices, and coercive messaging. Yet when Tokyo executed a highly visible and politically provocative naval move through the very corridor China treats as sacred, the Chinese leadership was reduced to watching and condemning. That is why this was far more than a routine freedom of navigation passage. It was a direct test of Chinese coercive power, and Beijing failed the test in the most public way possible. A state that constantly speaks the language of red lines and historic missions found itself unable to stop a single Japanese warship from sailing where it said nobody should sail. Tokyo clearly intended that effect. This was not an accidental moment or an impulsive military decision made in anger. It was the outward expression of a deeper strategic shift that has been building inside Japan for years, and that now appears to be entering a much more assertive phase. The old Japanese posture of passive endurance, formal protest, and carefully calibrated restraint is being discarded. For decades, Japan tried to manage Chinese pressure through caution, legal language, and measured diplomatic balance. But Beijing interpreted restraint as weakness and kept escalating anyway. It harassed the waters around the Senkaku Islands, increased air and maritime pressure near critical Japanese approaches, and used civilian-looking fishing fleets, Coast Guard vessels, and gray zone tactics to chip away at Tokyo's position without crossing into open war. The result was not stability. It was an expanding pressure campaign. Japan has now concluded that the only way to stop that campaign is to confront it. China's public reaction to the transit only reinforced that perception. Beijing denounced the Japanese move through Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo, calling it a provocation, a military show of force, and a serious blow to bilateral relations. But that was all it could do. The language was harsh, yet the practical response was empty. And that emptiness mattered more than the statement itself. Because while China condemned the passage before the cameras, it had already been unable to stop it in the water. The disconnect was glaring. For all the noise about sovereignty and deterrence, Beijing could not turn words into physical control when it mattered most. The transit did not just irritate China. It exposed the limits of Chinese intimidation against a Japan that is no longer willing to bend. That humiliation was amplified by the broader regional context. Only months earlier, in March and April 2026, China had conducted a massive 40-day blockade rehearsal around Taiwan. During that period, Beijing used military exercises, sea lane pressure, and airspace controls to rehearse the kind of suffocating coercion it would want in a real crisis. At one point, airspace restrictions reaching from the surface to unlimited altitude under the SFCUNL code helped send a chilling signal. China wanted the region to understand that it could close off access, isolate Taiwan, and force surrounding states to operate on Beijing's terms. The entire point of that exercise was psychological as much as operational. China wanted to normalize fear. It wanted the world to internalize the idea that a Chinese blockade, once declared, would simply be accepted. Then a single Japanese destroyer sailed through the Taiwan Strait and shredded that illusion. To understand why Tokyo was willing to make such a risky move, you have to look at the map the way military planners do. China's biggest strategic frustration in the Western Pacific is geography. No matter how many warships, submarines, missiles, and aircraft Beijing builds, it still has to break out into the Pacific through a chain of islands and straits that it does not fully control. In Chinese military thinking, the first island chain is both an obstacle and a cage. It stretches from southern Japan through Okinawa and down toward Taiwan, forming a natural barrier between China's coastal seas and the open Pacific. And at the heart of that problem for Beijing are the narrow channels and contested island zones that Japan helps control. The Senkaku Islands and the Miyako Strait are especially important. These are not just dots on a map. They are strategic locks. Whoever can dominate them can shape access, constrain movement, and impose military costs on any fleet trying to force its way through. That is why China has spent years pressuring Japan in precisely those areas. Around the Senkaku Islands, Beijing has turned routine presence into a permanent war of nerves. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, maritime militia fleets, and supporting state assets have repeatedly entered sensitive waters to probe Japan's will, test response times, and normalize Chinese encroachment. One of the most serious episodes came in March 2026, when 4 heavily armed Chinese Coast Guard ships reportedly entered Japanese territorial waters roughly 12 miles off Minamikojima Island and remained there for 3 full days. The objective was not just to challenge maritime jurisdiction. It was to pressure Tokyo psychologically and politically to see whether Japan would retreat into the familiar pattern of warning messages and carefully worded complaints. But this time, the response was different. Japanese Coast Guard units deployed immediately, patrol aircraft flew over the Chinese vessels, and the intruders were tracked continuously until they withdrew. That episode did not look like the old Japan. It looked like a Japan that had decided it would no longer absorb pressure quietly. The same pattern had already emerged weeks earlier. In February 2026, a Chinese fishing fleet of more than 20 vessels reportedly entered Japan's exclusive economic zone near the Senkaku area in what Tokyo viewed not as ordinary fishing activity, but as a gray zone operation disguised in civilian form. That is a classic Chinese tactic. Use civilian-looking platforms to create operational ambiguity, gain positional advantage, and complicate military response. But Japan responded with far more force than Beijing likely expected. Military helicopters and armed patrol vessels moved into the area, using direct physical presence to break up the pressure tactic. The Chinese flotilla withdrew. Then came another alarming move in January, when China organized rows of maritime militia vessels into what looked like a floating wall, a rehearsal for the kind of massed civilian maritime blockade structure that could one day be used to isolate Taiwan or restrict the movement of southern Japan. Tokyo understood the message. It was not looking at disconnected incidents. It was watching a pattern of slow encirclement. That is why the Taiwan Strait transit was not a spontaneous emotional reaction. It was the culmination of months of mounting Japanese resolve. Tokyo had reached the conclusion that if it kept responding to Chinese gray zone tactics with defensive language alone, Beijing would continue escalating until it had reshaped the region without firing a shot. So Japan chose escalation in the language Beijing understands best: controlled, visible, military presence. And it chose the moment carefully. The destroyer's passage came almost immediately after the arrival of Russian warships at the Zhanjiang Naval Base in southern China. That port visit was not routine. Two Staragushchi-class combat corvettes from Russia's Pacific Fleet, Sovrashiny and Rezki, arrived alongside the large replenishment ship Pechenga. The visit was meant to last 5 days and was clearly designed to project Moscow-Beijing solidarity at sea. Russian and Chinese sailors stood together. Commanders smiled for cameras, and the message was unmistakable. The Pacific is becoming a theater of coordinated pressure. Tokyo answered by cutting straight through the political center of that message. The transit by JS Ikazuchi was Japan's way of saying that neither Chinese blockade theatrics nor Russian-Chinese naval symbolism would intimidate it anymore. And for Japan, Russia is not some secondary factor in this equation. The northern threat is deeply real, deeply historical, and deeply emotional. Since the end of the Second World War, the Kuril Islands dispute, which Japan refers to as the Northern Territories issue, has remained an open wound. Those islands are not just symbols of unresolved history. They are active strategic terrain. Russia has steadily militarized them, using the chain as part of its broader effort to reinforce its Pacific posture and harden the Sea of Okhotsk into a protective bastion for ballistic missile submarines. From Tokyo's perspective, Moscow is not simply occupying disputed islands. It is trying to turn them into a permanent armed outpost overlooking Japan. The military implications are serious. Russian Pacific Fleet units routinely move out of Vladivostok and operate around Japan's northern approaches, sailing near Hokkaido and passing through narrow strategic straits such as Tsugaru and Soya. These movements are not accidental. They are signals. They remind Tokyo that Russia retains the power to apply pressure from the north even while mired in war elsewhere. Despite the enormous losses Moscow has suffered in Ukraine, including damage to its fleet and heavy losses in personnel, it still uses its Pacific assets and nuclear submarine posture to keep Japan under strategic tension. And when Russia synchronizes that pressure with Chinese naval activism to Japan's south and southwest, the result is exactly the kind of two-front maritime stress that Japanese planners have feared for years. That is why the timing of the Strait transit mattered so much. Japan was not just confronting China. It was sending a message to both powers at once. The Pacific is not your intimidation zone. What gives Tokyo the confidence to do this now is a transformation that has been underway for years, but is now entering full view. Japan has effectively torn up the mental restraints of the old post-war pacifist model. It is no longer content to act as a reactive shield sitting behind constitutional caution while rivals accumulate power around it. Instead, it is becoming an active maritime and aerospace force designed to project deterrence across the very choke points China and Russia care most about. One of the clearest symbols of that transformation is the conversion of the Izumo and Kaga from helicopter carriers into ships capable of operating F-35B stealth fighters. These are not cosmetic upgrades. With heat-resistant decks and the ability to carry roughly 12 to 15 F-35Bs each, those ships turn mobile sea space into deployable airfields. That means Japan can move air power rapidly toward critical zones like the Miyako Strait, the Senkaku area, or wider Pacific approaches without depending solely on land bases. This fundamentally changes the military picture. China may have numbers, but Japan is building flexibility, reach, and layered deterrence. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force fields more than 48 advanced modern destroyers, including powerful classes such as the Maya and Ikazuchi types, many equipped with the Aegis combat system. That gives Tokyo the ability to track and engage large numbers of aerial threats across vast battle space. But Japan has not stopped at defense. It has also extended its offensive reach dramatically. By integrating long-range Type 12 and Type 17 anti-ship missiles, as well as US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, Japan has moved beyond the old doctrine of static homeland protection. It is building the ability to strike hostile ships and key targets at standoff ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. That means Japan is no longer just guarding its own coastline. It is constructing the capacity to contest maritime space far beyond it. And below the surface, Japan may be even more dangerous. Its fleet of around 22 ultra-quiet lithium-ion battery diesel-electric submarines, built around the Soryu and newer Taigi classes, gives Tokyo a silent hunting arm that is ideal for the narrow waters China must traverse to reach the open Pacific. These submarines are particularly relevant in places like the Miyako Strait and the Bashi Channel, where confined geography compresses maneuver and increases the lethality of ambush. For China, the first island chain is already a strategic headache. With Japanese submarines operating like ghosts in those waters, backed by destroyers, mobile sea-based aviation, and long-range missiles, that headache becomes a full-spectrum military nightmare. The Chinese Navy may be larger, but getting through the exits is another matter entirely. This is why Beijing's old playbook is becoming less effective. Maritime militia swarms, fishing fleet pressure tactics, Coast Guard intrusions, and blockade rehearsals depend on one basic assumption: that the other side will tolerate incremental escalation because it fears major confrontation more than China does. Japan is now overturning that assumption. It is showing that it will answer gray zone tactics with real military posture, symbolic pressure with harder symbolism, and intimidation with visible counter-intimidation. In that context, the transit by JS Ikazuchi was not just a show of courage. It was a declaration that Tokyo is changing the strategic grammar of East Asia. China may still be able to create crises, but it can no longer assume that Japan will play the role Beijing assigned to it. And that is what makes this moment so important historically. For decades, a great deal of regional planning rested on the notion that Japan would remain essentially defensive in instinct, cautious in crisis, and reluctant to confront its rivals directly except through alliance coordination and legal framing. That Japan is disappearing. In its place is emerging a state that still understands the cost of war, still acts with discipline, but is no longer willing to let caution become strategic paralysis. The passage through the Taiwan Strait made that unmistakable. Tokyo did not just defend a principle. It imposed a reality. It showed that China's massive blockade exercises, its sovereignty theatrics, and even its alignment with Russia cannot automatically freeze Japanese action. The ship sailed. China watched. Russia got the message, and the whole region took note. That is why this 14-hour transit may be remembered as more than a naval episode. It may mark the moment Japan publicly crossed the threshold from managed restraint into active maritime resistance. Not reckless escalation, not uncontrolled aggression, but something more durable and arguably more dangerous for Beijing's ambitions: disciplined resolve backed by real power. The age in which China could rely on Japan's psychological hesitation appears to be ending. And once that hesitation disappears, the waters of the Western Pacific become far less predictable for everyone involved. One thing is now clear. The old image of Japan sheltering quietly in its ports while issuing statements of concern during crises no longer matches reality. The state that once absorbed pressure is now preparing to return it. The country that once waited for the storm is now learning how to become one. And if Beijing and Moscow fail to understand what that means, they may discover too late that the balance of fear in East Asia has already started to shift. This is Strategic Horizon Watch.